Everybody,
Hello.
welcome to the Willamette Valley Energy Security Plan Roadshow meeting. A little bit of administrative things. The meeting's being recorded, so if you don't want to be on the recording, it might not be the best space for you. And our presenter just showed up, so I won't. Portland traffic. So Max, I just mentioned that we're being recorded, but we're good to go. Are you presenting? Let me introduce the team real quick. My name is Tom Cecilia. I'm the Hanford hydrogeologist and fuel specialist at ODO. I'm joined by my assistant director, Max Woods, and our contracting team, Dr. Casey Stedman and Andrew Heisman.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for bearing with me as I'm a few minutes late here. I live in Portland and say no more. So we're talking about the Oregon Energy Security Plan. I know you already know that because that's why you're here. And so we've got a brief agenda. I'm gonna go through, tell you what we're gonna tell you about, and we'll tell you those things, and we'll tell you what we told you, kind of that type of typical pattern. We'll start a little bit about what the project is. Why it matters, talk about the timeline, the structure of the project, methods, take a quick break, and then we're going to dive into preliminary results. And this will be led by Dr. Casey Stedman and our team, contracting team, and kind of see what we're going to get through there. Next steps, talk about the energy strategy, which is a separate project that ODO has ongoing. Michael Friels from our shop is here to talk about that a little bit, do some Q&A. And I'd like to say at the beginning, we're going to make this an interactive time here together, an interactive meeting. We're really looking for feedback, we're looking for input from people here, from people online, to talk about sort of give us input on the results that we're going to roll out here. You know, you probably sit through in your days many PowerPoint presentations, someone like me telling you information. There's a little bit of that. We're also going to make it a little more interactive. We have a program called Slido, which you can access on your phones, your computers. I think we also have some hard copies of the, if you don't want to use your phone or it just feels a little cumbersome if you're in the room here, we have some hard copies of the document. If you're online, using your computer is a good way to do it. It's pretty easy on a laptop. It's a little more tricky on a phone. We'll get to that. So anyway, before we get really diving in, let's talk about who we are. Here you are in the building, the Oregon Department of Energy. Thanks for coming, or you're online, watching me talk. I work for the Oregon Department of Energy. About ODO, we've got a couple of things here about all the stuff we do. You know, the energy security plan that we're leading here fits right into our strategy and our mission. Awesome. So there's another sort of wrap up about why we're here. Share project progress, discuss risk assessment results, led by Dr. Stedman, as I mentioned, and trying to get input on mitigation measures to reduce those risks. Let's say regional. We should note that, I think Tom mentioned at the very beginning, this is our Willamette Valley regional meeting. The state, we have a map, well, we got a map somewhere in there. The state, we've sort of divided it up into 6 regions, just for purposes of sort of coordination on our project. The regions that we use are also used by the Oregon Department of Emergency Management. So it's consistency with other state agency. 6 regions, and between last week and this week, we're going to every one of those regions for a similar meeting like this, where we'll talk about, there's some general information we'll talk about, and we'll talk about some specific results for the region here. The Willamette Valley region is Marion County, Lane County, Lynn County, Douglas County, Polk, yeah. Is that right? I think that's the county list. We have a map. I'll show you that map. There's also a Northwest region, Portland Metro region, Cascades region. Yesterday, you guys were in Bend yesterday talking with the Cascades region, or the central part of the state, east of the Cascades, Eastern region. Last week, Tom and I were in Pendleton. We were also in Tillamook last week in Portland. And then after this meeting, we're driving down to Medford and having a similar meeting. So trying to get out across the state the best we can. Oh, and on this slide. Oh, this is just who we are again. So led by the Department of Energy, our contracting team from CNA, they have a partner with a subcontractor called Haley and Aldrich. And if anybody works in geotechnical analysis in the state or seismic risk, seismic hazards, Haley and Aldridge is a leader in the state on that type of engineering and analysis. They've done a lot of work for state government and other partners on seismic risk and geotechnical hazards across the state, of which there are many, probably didn't know. Oregon PUC staff, they're not here today, but Oregon Public Utility Commission staff has been involved with us. Make a note of that. And then you, Rick. Okay. So we'll talk about why we're doing a state energy security plan and what the contents of that plan have to be. So we got two little boxes up here in the room on the slide, sort of the upper right-hand corner there. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and Oregon Senate Bill 1567. Fundamentally, we're doing an Oregon energy security plan because it's a good idea. We're also doing it because the federal government and the state government told us to do the thing, so we're doing it. Why is it coming from the Department of Energy? It makes sense, it's a good fit for us, but also because legislation tells us to do this project, so we are. The federal legislation from, we call the IIJA, Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, passed by Congress in 2021, provides money. So this project is funded by federal grants to state governments like ourselves to do this work. And it has requirements that the plan has to include. These are the 6 required elements of that plan. You can read them there, I won't read them to you. It's important just for note, the federal government says we have to do this. All states have to have an energy security plan. Those plans due on September 30th of this year will actually be scored and graded by the US Department of Energy, our federal counterparts. They use a contractor, Pacific Northwest National Lab, to do that scoring. We have to have a passing plan in their eyes. If we don't have a passing plan, we get put on the remedial track, and they can actually withhold further funding from our agency, not for just for this project, but for other funding that we receive. So we're really incentivized financially from our feds to do this. We're also incentivized because it's a good idea, as I mentioned, to help out the state. Well, that's about the federal regulation. The Senate, Oregon legislature, I should say, led by Senate Bill 1567, 2 years ago, that was in spring of 2022, I believe, passed a bill similarly directing ODO to do the state energy security plan. And in that bill, there were a few additional elements added top of the federal requirements, particularly around fuel, fueling infrastructure, fueling resilience, fueling risk in our state. Liquid fuel, shall I say, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, primarily those 3 products. We'll talk about that a little bit here and why that matters, but just suffice to say that the federal legislation is more high level. The state legislation has a little more directive, particularly around fuels. If anybody works in this space, SB 1567 is also the bill that directs Oregon DEQ to do their seismic upgrade assessment at major tanks, major fueling tanks in Multnomah County, Columbia County, Lane County. Most people think of that as the Portland Fuels Terminal, if you're familiar with that area, which is on seismically risky land. That bill also directs DEQ to do a seismic upgrade, and then it directs us to do energy security plan considering of fuels. So a little bit of the background here. What is the energy security goal? The blue text is adopted from the federal government. That's sort of a standard definition. And then the red and underlined is words that we added into the state level to acknowledge that price affordability is important and it matters. And you can have all the energy, supply available, but if it's at a price that people can't really afford, that's an important consideration. That's we'll talk a little bit later today about mitigation measures, and that really is an important consideration. That there's all sorts of things we could do to harden our infrastructure systems, but they can get pretty expensive pretty quickly. We have to be realistic about the cost. Yeah, so there we are. So maybe I should mention at the very beginning, but we're mostly talking natural hazards to energy infrastructure, as well as cybersecurity and some physical risks that we'll talk about a little bit as well. Physical risks, you may be familiar with news the last few years of individuals actually attacking substations or electrical infrastructure with guns, that kind of thing. So that's in our scope here. Just kind of set the stage. And our strategy. Well, this is kind of what we've been guided by, or directed to ourselves to do this plan. Really, this is acknowledgement, the top line, that there's a lot of information that's already been done around energy security and energy resilience in the state by other state agencies, mostly by utilities. So utilities have done a lot of this work. as already, and some other state agencies and various organizations. So part of our task is to get that information, consolidate it into one location, and make sure that the state can help our partners with information collection. That's part of our task. And then we also are doing our own analysis based on information and data we've collected. We'll get to that today as well. So I just want to make an acknowledgement that a lot of information exists in the streets. We're not necessarily replicating what Pacific Corps or Northwest Natural is doing for their own resilience and security purposes. We're trying to coordinate with them and understand their programs and how we can figure out how to help. So this is the slide about the fuel, sort of before we get into some of the details. I mentioned about the fueling piece, the fuel resilience piece that was added into our project by Senate Bill 1567. And really the top line there recommends strategies to increase geographic diversity of fuel storage in Oregon. That's kind of a lot of words. What that really means, what the directive to us from the Senate is that in thinking of an emergency situation, the concept is that it is better to have more fuel in the communities where it's needed. So at the time of an emergency, you have more fuel. As long as that fuel is accessible, it's in a configuration, a container, a tank that's seismically safe. And think about the scenario that we often think about as the Cascadia subduction to an earthquake. When that earthquake strikes 9.0, a lot of devastation, particularly on the coast, western parts of the state, kind of decreasing inland. The idea is that we're able to sort of pre-deploy, if you will, fuel across the state that will have more on hand. Maybe you might have had a week's worth of supply. Maybe we can give you 2 weeks worth of supply. That's sort of the concept. To get there is a lot of work, a lot of assessment of existing infrastructure. We've got some maps we can show you in a little bit, and particularly around public facilities. That's really the directive, is to look at public facilities, consider public works yards, ODOT facilities, maintenance yards, utilities have their own fueling yards. Start looking at those from a seismic resilience perspective, talking to the owners and operators, and considering if there's a way to augment that capacity. That's like as I just described. Just as sort of we said this in Portland, matter, I think a little more there, but also here. The project is not intended to replace the fuel terminals in Portland. People ask us that question a lot. Fuel terminals in Portland are a seismically risky area, we know that, but this project is not intended to replace those. Just kind of get that out. Okay, we also have a lot of information. We have a lot of ways to get information. So we got a QR code up here. You can scan it with your phone. We got a link to a website, an email address that comes to Tom, and then it goes out to us. So, you know, we kind of say to everybody who's already participated in some of our work is thank you for participating, surveys, data collection. We've done that over the last few months. And this is sort of where we're at right now with our work and tracking the progress on the QR code for supply. Let's stay in touch. What's left? Today, doing these meetings, so that's very top line there as we're doing these meetings. Assessing fuel storage capacity, recommended areas to increase storage. That's a big piece of work that we're going to be working on heavily this summer. And then say cross the T's, dot the I's on our September 2024 submittal of the actual plan itself. The last point is important. This isn't, our intention here is not to make a plan that just sits on a shelf and is, you know, compliant with DOE, US DOE requirements, and everybody says, yay, we met the requirements. It's to make this a big P program, as we might say in government, which is to say an ongoing effort by our team to every year to evaluate and to update the energy security plan, talking to partners, talking to people that maybe didn't get to talk to this time around. We'll be talking in more detail to people we did talk to a little bit, collecting more information, reassessing risks as they might change in coming years. We're also required to do that. The US DOE requires us to review the plan every year. The state says every 2 years. So we'll be on a regular cycle for reviewing and working on this project. Okay, project timeline and structure. And this is when I pass to Casey.
Yes.
Thank you.
Before I do take over, does anyone have any questions at this point?
We had a question in the chat from Brandy. When you say public, does that also include transportation special districts?
If transportation special districts own a fuel storage facility, then yes, those would probably qualify as public.
Public partners.
Public partners. Yeah, that's a good point. If you can make sure people get to it. So we got a map a little bit later. We talk about public and public partners. Kind of created a second category of maybe quasi government organizations that have fuel. And I think transportation districts would probably clearly fit into that area. Also universities, utilities, those sort of entities are also on that list of, I guess we call them quasi-public or public partnership, but I think the answer is yes.
And telecommunications as well.
Telecommunications, right, absolutely. Yeah.
So two more questions,
Yeah.
and then from Anne, is this the first plan of this type that the state has done?
Yes.
Second one from Steve, what about public universities? Are you interested in our storage capacity?
Yes. Yes, we are very much so. And to all those questions, if you are a university or a transit district employee or operator, you make sure we have your contact information. We'd love to talk to you after this meeting and kind of talk details. Yeah.
And there have been plans of this type, but they've been more isolated, and this is the first real holistic vision of the state's energy system.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I gave a quick answer to a long question. There isn't a plan that exists. There is not an Oregon energy security plan right now. This will be the first major iteration. We did do a draft version of this plan last year, and you can find that on our website. That version is more of an internal document done by staff. We didn't do these meetings. We had to do that because USDA said you have to do something, so we did. It's still a pretty good document. But it's mostly a consolidation of information we already had, and we didn't have our contractors on board. So it's a bit of a draft. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, there was a report created by our agency called the Energy Assurance Plan. That's out of date. It hasn't been updated. And so we don't rely upon that as a legitimate document. As I mentioned earlier, other entities in the state have similar types of plans, but nobody that we're not, our agency has never done a comprehensive statewide energy security. There's a little more details to. Yes, sir.
How have you addressed the crossover between different lines of thought? So here you're addressing fuel and accessibility of fuel, but it isn't accessible unless you have power. So now you're into a second stream. So recently we had an ice storm down in Springfield, and probably 70% or more of the fuel that was in the tanks of all the gas stations, nobody could get. So they were driving 30 miles just to fill up.
Yeah.
So how do you address the crossing?
Yeah, it's a difficult situation, and we're well aware of that. At a gas station, almost every gas station relies upon electricity to operate their pumps, especially all commercial fueling stations. We do have analysis of what we call them interdependencies, kind of a long word to say exactly what you just said. That the energy is not so stated, it doesn't sit in one little stream, right? Electricity. Natural gas relies upon electric pumps to move along natural gas, just as another example. Natural gas feeds power plants that create electricity. And as you mentioned, the example on gas relying upon electricity for pumps. So there's interconnections between all those. When we look at the fuel piece in particular for where the state may want to consider additional storage, accessibility is a really important part. We would like to see an on-site generator that would make sure that those emergency fuels locations have the ability to create power on site if they don't have grid power to make sure that the pumps operate. So we have definitely considered.
Or battery backup.
Or battery backup, right? There's other ways, but as long as they have an electricity source, because that's really, it's necessary. There are mechanical pumps that exist, but it's unwieldy to pump a lot of fuel with a mechanical pump.
Just one more question.
Oh, sure.
Is there a minimum size that you're considering for fuel storage? Do you already have access to the smaller fueling stations data via permit?
We have access, we have information of all tanks that are regulated in the state by Oregon DEQ, and this is a little sneak preview, by Oregon DEQ and Oregon State Fire Marshal. Those two organizations regulate and license fuel storage of a certain size. We go down to pretty small, like 500-gallon tanks, Tom. I think we've got some information, pretty small capacity. So we purposefully are open. And it might be in some locations where 500 gallons really makes a big difference. If you can fuel your fire truck with 500 gallons in a small community, that's a nice to have. We haven't set a limit on size. Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. So Max has told us what we're doing. Now what I want to do is share with you a little bit about how we're approaching this. And so first we'll start with our timeline for the project and the structure in general. And I always want to point us back to our objectives. So our goals here are to identify, assess, and mitigate risks to our energy infrastructure in order that we can plan for, respond to, and recover from events that could disrupt our energy supply. In an effort to achieve these objectives, we're working through this series of activities, starting with stakeholder engagement. So in this Gantt chart, engagement is the top bar, and it spans the lifetime of this project, starting last fall, enduring through to this summer. We do consider engagement to really be the backbone to this project. We're very aware that if the ESP doesn't reflect the priorities as they vary across the regions in the state, that it won't be successful. So this is where your input today included is going to be extremely important for the project. We also had many months focused almost exclusively on data collection, getting the highest quality data possible across the different energy subsectors. We conducted the actual risk assessment. I'll get into our approach there in a moment. And then generated risk mitigation measures, which you will be giving us feedback on today, and so that we can understand how those should be prioritized specific to your region in the Willamette Valley. And then, of course, we do have the fuel storage branch of this project that Max has been speaking to. So the geospatial structure, we have, as Max mentioned, adopted the 6 regions as defined by OEM. So many of you in this room may already be familiar with the map on the left. Those 6 regions are color-coded in that map. We're also reaching out to each of the tribal governments to get their perspectives on this plan. So on the right, you can see a snapshot of just the spatial distribution of their headquarters throughout the state. And then within the energy sector itself, we're dividing it into 3 subsectors. So all of our information will be categorized under electricity, natural gas, and then liquid fuels. I mentioned the importance of stakeholder engagement. So here's a summary of our efforts. We started off with our stakeholder kickoff at the beginning of this project last fall. And then we had 2 parallel efforts that were focused on collecting data, as I mentioned, and then also improving our understanding of the threats that are impacting the energy systems across the state. And so one of these efforts was focused on the private sector, and the other focused on the public sector, working to get perspectives across each of the 6 regions. We do have, of course, meetings related to fuel storage, and then right now we're in the middle of what we're calling the Roadshow, where we're visiting each of these 6 regions, conducting the meetings like the one we're in right now. And then once we compile the final results, we'll have a project rollout in the coming months. So just a snapshot of where we stand within this roadshow. As Max mentioned, we covered several regions last week. We were in the Cascades yesterday, and today we're with you guys in the Willamette Valley, and tomorrow we'll be in the Southwest region. So our approach, our methods. You guys do have a handout, and so these maps are in that handout in greater detail for reference. Due to the time, if you don't have a hard copy, they're on the side of the room. If you're online, the link is in the chat, so please do feel free to go follow that link so that you have access to this handout. So we can't get into the details of each of these maps in today's meeting, but as I mentioned, I wanted you guys to have access to them so that you can have an understanding of where different types of assets are located throughout the state. So what you'll find is for electricity, a series of 3 maps. First, we have sourcing. So these are the different types of power plants sized by their capacity. Transmission, these are the major transmission lines throughout the state. Customers, I'll actually address a few details of this map in the next slide, so I'll come back to that one. For natural gas, one single map for that system, so the major pipelines, the major service providers and their territories. For liquid fuels, we actually have quite a collection of maps that we've been generating for this subsector because there are several commodities that fall under this category. I've been giving you an example in your handout for diesel, and this highlights some of these most dominant flow paths for different liquid fuels in the state. So first we have sourcing. You'll see a lot of imports via pipeline from the north, maritime imports as well, and then some references to truck and railroad. And then distribution. This map is the result of a routing analysis that we conducted that helps us to identify some of the major roadways that we depend on for distributing diesel and many other liquid fuel commodities. So as I mentioned, I would come back to the electricity map focused on customers. What I'd like to highlight here is that we have 41 electric utilities in the state. 3 of these are investor owned. And this map has a pie chart for each of the counties in the state. And those pie charts are sized by the number of customers served within that county. And then each color within the pie represents the different type of utility that serves that customer. And so you can see that the red color, which represents the IOUs, is a pretty dominant color throughout each of these pie charts. So they play a major role throughout the state. We do have quite a big influence of the cooperative owned utilities, which are in the blue color, particularly in the eastern region. And then you can see municipal utilities in yellow and people's utilities in orange. So we had to narrow down the number of threats that would be analyzed in the risk assessment. So this is based on stakeholder engagement feedback, literature reviews, the actual data that's available to analyze these threats. And this is our final list of threats that were included in this round of development of the ESP. So for natural hazards, we have the Cascadia subduction zone, earthquake and tsunami. This is specifically the 9.0 scenario. We have drought, flood, lightning, wildfire, windstorm, and winter storm. And then human-caused threats, we have cyber attacks and physical attacks. Something important to note with the human-caused threats is that these are defined as intentional attacks on energy systems. So this would not include something like a car accident that would damage a piece of infrastructure. It has to be an intentional act. For the natural hazards, we're able to look at data available such as historical incidences, future projections, simulations, combination of different data inputs, and we can identify these natural hazard zones. Again, we don't have time to get into the detail of each of these maps, but this is referenced in your handout if you want to take a closer look at it. The biggest takeaway here is that there's a lot of variability in the distribution and the extent of the different hazard zones. So if we look at something like a flood hazard in the top right, you can see the distribution and that it is present in all 6 of the regions, but the extent is somewhat limited. It doesn't cover a big spatial area relative to some other threats, such as annualized drought, which is just to the left of flood. And so for annualized drought, quite a bit of a large spatial extent across the 3 regions in which it's present, but the distribution, it's not a major threat across all 6 of the regions. So in our approach for technical analysis, what we would do is look at these natural hazard zones and how they overlay with the infrastructure for each of these energy systems. We can look at the types of assets, the characteristics of those assets, the flow of the commodity through that system. And through a technical analysis, we can evaluate the vulnerability of a specific region to a specific threat. This is a very data-intense process. And for the subsector of liquid fuels, we were able to secure the data we needed within the timeframe of this project to conduct this technical analysis. Given the time constraints, however, for electricity and natural gas, we could not secure the data that we needed that would allow us to do this robust analysis. So what we had to do was pivot. And we developed what we're calling a hybrid survey, which gave an opportunity to the utilities and service providers to conduct a self-assessment and give us the inputs we would need to come to the vulnerability rankings. So for natural hazards, we use the technical analysis for liquid fuels, and we use the hybrid survey for electric and natural gas. With human-caused threats, we can't create a hazard zone like we can for natural hazards just because of the nature of these threats. So for consistency, we use the same approach of the hybrid survey across all 3 of the energy subsectors for the human-caused threats. So how did we break down this analysis? Whether we did the technical approach or the hybrid survey approach, we used these same categories of information in the same scoring system. So we started with exposure. This is looking at, as I mentioned before, like historical incidences, projections, simulations, and the infrastructure. And we're looking at the number of assets and the types of assets that are exposed within that hazard zone and how frequently they're exposed to a given threat. We also considered sensitivity. So this would be the inherent qualities of the type of asset that would inform us on how it would be affected by a specific threat. And we're just looking at how many of these system elements are sensitive to the threat. We then considered potential impact. So this is focused on the customers that are impacted and how long it takes to restore service. And then adaptive capacity, we're focusing on a number of physical measures and operational measures. We're using the term operational in a very broad sense here. And then we're also considering the maturity of the implementation of those measures across the different service providers. And what we can do is simplify this down into a rating system for each of these 4 categories, where there would score somewhere between 0 and 3. We simply add those numbers together to get a final vulnerability ranking for each region and each threat. So in this scenario, we have exposure that scores high, so the value would be 3, high sensitivity with a value of 1, high potential impact with a value of 3, and then very high adaptive capacity with a value of 0. The scoring here is inverse. So we simply add those together. Our final score is 7, and this would fall into the range of a moderate level of vulnerability. Okay, so at this point, we've given you guys an overview of what we're doing and how we're approaching it. Whenever we come back from the break, this is where we're going to start really engaging with you guys and getting more and more feedback as we work through our preliminary results. So if you haven't yet, please do connect to Slido. Again, if you're on a phone, you might prefer using a hard copy in the room. It can be a little bit cumbersome on a phone. If you have a laptop, probably the easiest way to do this is through a laptop. If you're joining us online, the link is in the chat, so you can go ahead and connect. You'll be prompted to give us your name and email address. You'll need to enter that. All of these will be anonymous. We'll compile all the data later, but this is so we can follow up with any questions, particularly if you want to know about fuel storage and working with Odo on that. So we'll take a moment, see if we have any questions before we go on break.
Good one.
Okay.
What other liquid fuels are there besides diesel?
Yeah, so we have a collection. We have gasoline, diesel, biodiesel, aviation fuel. What are the others? We are considering propane,
Renewable diesel.
renewable diesel.
Yeah, those are the main categories. Jet, diesel, and gasoline are primary, and then increasingly renewable fuels, ethanol, which is primarily ethanol and then renewable diesel.
And red dye diesel as well, but that's not necessarily tracked separately.
Right. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? All right, folks, we'll go ahead and take 5 minutes so you can connect on Slido if you haven't yet, or if you need to take a quick break before we come back and start a little bit more engagement and feedback from you guys. Thank you so much.
All right, we'll go back here. Thanks, everybody. I realized that we didn't do introductions of everybody here. And if you wouldn't mind, you know who we are. Maybe we can go around the room and online and just collect some introductions. Is that okay with everybody? We'll start here.
Sure. I'm Robert Weeks and I'm here provided representing citizens for energy security.
Okay.
I'm concerned about things going on with the power distribution.
Received an email from you, I believe. Yeah, and an assessment. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.
I'm Zachary, so here to request actual.
Oh, great. Thanks, Zach. Appreciate it.
Dean Scott from Lieber, here on citizens concerned about flooding news.
Great. Thank you very much.
Greg Organic, I'm with Georgia Water Resources Department.
Oh.
And hydroelectric coordinator.
Oh, okay. We met yesterday with OWRD on groundwater. It's completely different. We do, you know, we also do nuclear safety and radiological waste and things. And
Right.
your counterpart, Tim Seymour, was talking about all day. Cool. Thanks for coming.
I'm Martin Sanchez, I'm with OWRD as well, and hydroelectric project.
Hydropower, I mean, that's, well, we won't really talk about that too much here, but you can probably see the reports we all read about declining hydropower as there's less water in the rivers at the right times for hydropower. It's a big issue.
Mike Reels, I'm a policy analyst, energy department, and I'm talking about the energy strategy.
Cool. Should we go online? I think we can do the audio, right?
Yep. So everybody online, when I call your name, just please unmute and provide an introduction. And I'll just go down the list. So Anne, will you please start?
Ann Castleton. I live in the Portland metro region, but I missed that one. I'm a public member of OSPAC, the Oregon Seismic Safety Policy Advisory Committee.
Great. Thanks, Anne.
All right, Janine. Let's get that one.
Hey, good morning. Sorry, my mute wasn't coming up. I'm Janine Parisi. I'm the Resiliency Program Manager for Eugene Water Electric Board.
Thank you. Jen.
Good morning, Jen Lewis Goff. I work for the Association of Oregon Counties and I oversee our public safety portfolio.
Kristen.
Hi all, Kristen Lee with Lane County Policy Division.
Thank you. Mike. All right, we'll come back to you, Mike. Randy.
Hi, Randy Navalinsky. I'm the Emergency Coordinator for Salem Area Mass Transit.
Great.
Scott. Back to Scott. Steve. Might not come back to Steve. Tony.
Tony Shecker, General Manager at Salem Electric for Oregon Rural Cooperatives.
Thank you, Tony. That it?
Yeah.
Anybody else that we missed? Okay, thanks, everybody. We are also recording this and it'll be posted on our website within a weekish or so. Take some processing time. So if you have colleagues who might want to watch this, you can send them to here, or if you were so excited to watch it again, you certainly could and review the content there. So we'll get that on our website as soon as we can. So preliminary results. We'll go into the fuels first, and I'll talk about fuels, which is a little different, as Casey mentioned, than electricity and natural gas based on data availability. So what we could do with our analysis. So we'll talk about fuel, and Casey's going to talk about more on the broader sphere of energy. So this is really around what I call the SB 1567 piece, which is a lot of words for fuel resilience. So that's our target. We talked about it before. Our target meaning assess fuel capacity, recommended areas to increase storage. Most of our data comes from two sources: Oregon DEQ and Oregon State Fire Marshal. Oregon DEQ licenses underground fuel storage. Oregon State Fire Marshal licenses above ground fuel storage. So that's how it is. They both have databases, as you can imagine, of their licensees. We got that information from them, and we were able to make an awesome map. And maybe this might look, if you're not a fuel guy, might look like a lot of information, right? For us, this is really great. It was the first time we've ever been able to really map in a GIS map all the fuel information in the state. So this is a map of the whole state. Here we are in the Willamette Valley region. A lot of information on here. We have these sort of top line numbers about estimates of gallons of fuel in different tanks. That's just, 414 million. That's all fuel sort of lumped together, just so you can kind of get a sense of how much capacity the state has. It kind of breaks it down a little bit by type, gasoline, diesel, jet, kind of see it in the other. The pie charts show the breakdown across the state by region of fuel capacity. And importantly, I'll note, people, if you can see me, but I'll point out this at the bottom, it says exclude fuel storage, terminal storage capacity. The reason we did that is because terminal storage dwarfs everything else. And there's so much terminal storage, particularly in the Port of Portland, that the pie chart would be over the whole state. You really couldn't see much else. So we excluded that. There's also terminals in Eugene and in Umatilla area. I don't think it's shown up there, but those are the major terminals as well as the Port of Portland. Of course, so those are the terminals there. All the dots are mapped fuel storage locations, and you can imagine where the people are is where the fuel is. And that's mostly in the valley. And then central part of the state, kind of clustered around Northeast Oregon as well. So regions where people are, that's where the fuel is. Okay, this is more specific, and this is the public sector fuel capacity. I mentioned earlier about that we're really looking at public and government and government partners. And that's the point earlier about transit districts. That would be a government partner. Maybe it's actually a government partner, so I'm not quite sure. Anyway, the blue dots are government, and the turquoise are government partners include universities, utilities, a few other entities. So that's really our target. In the valley region, I should say, those are the numbers we're looking at right here. A little bit over 2 million gallons of liquid fuel in 328 tanks, and break down by gasoline and diesel. Those numbers, I should say, are sort of estimates on how much fuel will be in a region at one time. Tanks are never 100% full. There's a safety reason why that's not the case. As you can imagine, with such throughput on a tank, as soon as you use some of it, it's now lower, right? So they fluctuate, but those are sort of approximate numbers in our range. Anyway, so that's highlighting the valleys, Willamette Valley region storage capacity there. This is an overlay, similar information with the pink, which is a little hard to tell on this map, but the pink is the earthquake overlay hazard. It's not the only hazard. Casey went through all the hazards that face our energy systems, but most significantly in this region and to the west, we often plan towards the Cascadia subduction zone 9.0 earthquake scenario. So we're looking at that as probably our worst case natural hazard, but I do recognize that fire, other hazards are very prevalent and important to consider too. This just shows that. So you can overlay the hazard mapping with the fuel locations, and again, where the people are, where the fuel are, and in the great state of Oregon, where there's a big risk for cyber. That's just sort of how it is, cyber. Storage disruption, 9/11 earthquake, we know these things. This lists the amount of gasoline in the valley that's outside of that highest risk area. So towards the east, that up into the foothills, you can see there is still considerable storage in the region that's outside of the worst zone. I think so. The state, I should take a step back on where the data is from. The pink is it very high and high risk? Is that so? The state is categorized by risk of seismic shaking. And we used information from our sister state agency called DOGAMI, Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, which maps these risks across the state. And they have, very high, medium, low, really low, something like that. They have a scale for risk from earthquake. And these are the high and very high risk is the pink. We haven't shown other risk. Now, if there's 9.0 earthquake, you will feel it. If you go up the Mackenzie River Valley, you're going to feel that shaking. But the estimates is it's not going to be as catastrophic as, out in Newport, as an example. So there you go. So that's useful information for us to know where those facilities are located in this region or outside of the worst risk zone for seismic shaking. Now, we also recognize that you're outside of the worst risk in the Willamette Valley, you might be in the worst risk for fire hazard because you're on the foothill of the Cascades and quite Labor Day fires came right through that region. I understand that. So it's not perfect, but for our assessment modeling purposes for consideration visual, this is important information. And this is a zoomed in map for just the valley region, not valley region. And that same pie chart again. Triangle is the fuel terminal in Eugene. I won't belabor the point, but people maybe don't realize this, that fuel in the region comes into Portland primarily. Comes into Portland via a major pipeline, and then there's a pipeline that goes from the Port of Portland fuel terminals right to Eugene fuel terminal. From there, it's trucked out across here in Salem, we're probably getting a lot of fuel that just comes by truck directly from Port of Portland, but further south in Eugene and in the southern part of the state, it goes out by a truck from the Eugene terminal. So there you go. It's sort of fuel, how it flows across the state. And then here we got a couple things here. I mentioned this earlier. If you are in this room or on the call and you have fuel operated, let us know. Let's talk. The last point is really for county emergency managers. An FPOD, a fuel point of distribution, is something that means something for people in emergency management response. It really just means in an emergency, where should fuel, counties and state designate locations where fuel should go for emergency response purposes. They're called fuel points of distribution. And just a point for the EMs, emergency managers listening, we can talk about co-locating a fuel pod with a resilient tank. It doesn't have to be that way, but it sure makes sense to consider those sort of synergies, if you will. Okay. So any questions on the fuel piece right now? And if not, I'm going to pass over to Casey. We're kind of diving into some of the things. Yes, sir.
You stayed away from resupply as a topic, so you focus very much on the in-ground storage and all the other aspects. But you mentioned verbally the mutual pipelines, but don't we see very much information about that? And also, there's just blue lines showing resupply coming in on a river that may be compromised after a major earthquake, certainly the dock structures. So there's no alternate shown for resupply by sea.
Yeah, I will, it's a good question. And you mean like resupply fuel, how fuel gets into these regions? Is that what you're thinking? We have that information. We didn't present everything on this screen. Tom, get
Yeah, so what we're looking at is a 9.0 Cascadia subduction limit. We understand the river will be non-navigable for some time based on tsunami debris and or bridges falling into the river. We see that in Baltimore, how long it takes to restore that. The pipelines are likely going to be down from damage. Even if they're not damaged, they'll be shut down as a precaution before they can be re-inspected and opened up again. What we're looking at with this increased storage is if there's communities that are stuck, if bridges are down and you have an island of people left after the earthquake that it's hard to get services to, we want them to have fuel to sustain themselves while people from the blue dots work their way in and reconnect those bridges and reduce the islands.
Maybe I'll just add that just as this isn't intended to be an emergency response plan necessarily, but we do have emergency response plans for fuel. I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning, but part of our agency's responsibility is emergency response for petroleum fuels. In the words of emergency response, it's emergency support function energy, 12, they give a number to it, and that number the 12, and that's for fuel particularly. So we have other reports and plans in place that do specifically talk about post-disaster fuel distribution channels. And we haven't published that here, but that is something we do have, and I'd be glad to talk about it at a later date if you're interested in that. But thank you for bringing it up.
And one last thing, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, estimates that they can have fuel deliveries to the state about 72 hours after the Cascadia subductions or earthquake. So really and it's not going to be a lot, but it's going to be something. So what we're looking at is trying to make sure that the responders in these areas can have fuel on day 0, day 1, while we're waiting for federal support to come in.
And that federal support assumes access, another good point. Right,
so there's also sometimes a disadvantage with sharing too much information for the very reason it compromises security. So I understand there's probably a need to know basis here. But that said, how far are you going to go with this? Because here's a plan, but then the other group would say, well, are you identifying things that maybe could be improved? Are you getting eyeballs on things that need to change?
So we're going to come up with a criteria of where additional fuel storage would be beneficial. So we know Oregon Department of Transportation has key bridges that they want to make sure are hardened or are first in this to get rebuilt after. So we want the fuel to be close to those, that type of metric. In addition to having a large flat paved area so trucks can come in and out, and you can do supply staging there too. So there's a number of criteria. There's no funding associated with this project, associated with increasing fuel storage yet. So we're just doing a broad brush recommendation of these are the things you should look for. And if you happen to have fuel storage and you want to increase in that area, and you meet our metrics, then you're going to be on the short list for if funding does become available in the future.
Okay.
Oh, question mark.
Yeah, just one
Yep.
general question
Yep.
online. What makes a tank resilient?
The ability to withstand seismic shaking and still provide service. And that would be, it's mostly an engineering consideration, foundation design, where it's actually located, and if that ground that it's on is, as an example, the Port of Portland, a lot of those tanks are on what's considered liquefiable soil, which means in a big earthquake, they kind of turn to liquid. We don't want that. So the geologic, immediate geology of a tank pad, as well as the engineering of a tank itself.
And generally speaking, the codes for tank construction changed, I think, in the mid to late 90s. So any tank built before that is, unless it's been retrofitted, is most likely not resilient.
And you'd be, like, tanks don't get built very frequently. And so a lot of Oregon's tank infrastructure dates from 50s and 60s, before the seismic risk was really understood. So this effort is on, it's not only the Star Agency, I should say, Oregon DEQ, as I mentioned, and private partners recognize there's some work to be done. Do what we can. Was there a question over here? No? Okay. I'll pass it over, please. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so this is going to be our first time for you guys to give us feedback via Slido. So we're going to be walking through the questions in Slido one section at a time. So please don't feel like you have to go in and answer everything right now. We're literally looking at one question. We just want to know if you're interested in engaging with Odo to increase fuel storage capacity. So if you do have interest in this, please let us know so that Odo knows to follow up with you. You will have already given us your name and email, so we have a way to do so. This, for reference, or your information, the Slido will be open through the end of the month. And so we're going to take some time and we'll pause, give you an opportunity to answer questions as we move along. If at any point you're not able to finish answering it, you can always come back to Slido later on to finish things up. And of course, it'll be open after this meeting as well. So you can wrap things up even beyond our official end time for the meeting. So as I've been talking, I'm assuming y'all have been able to answer yes or no. So we'll go ahead and move on to our next series of sections where we're going to have a rhythm to our correspondence here. And so what I'm going to do is first start with our information we've received from stakeholders thus far. So I'm going to tell you who has been engaging with us, what they've been telling us, what their feedback is, and then we'll do a quick check-in to see what you guys think of what other folks are telling us. Then we'll move on to our preliminary results for the actual risk assessment. This will be divided across each of the 3 subsectors that I outlined earlier. So we'll work through electricity, then natural gas and liquid fuels, and we'll follow the same series of content. We'll start with who's been engaging with us. I'm going to give you the final vulnerability rankings in the form of a matrix. And I'm going to dig in a little bit into adaptive capacity to show you some of the nuances in the feedback. And then we'll do a check-in again to see what your impression is of these preliminary results. Our final section will be focused on risk mitigation measures. Here we're going to start at a very high level all systems approach. Then we'll move on to more detailed risk mitigation measures related to electricity, then natural gas and liquid fuels. For this last section in particular, what I'm primarily going to do is just tee up the risk mitigation measures, and then we're going to do the check-in. You guys are really going to be doing the heavy lifting on this last section. We want to understand how you would prioritize these mitigation measures specifically for your region. So let's go ahead and dive into stakeholder engagement. So who has been working with us thus far? We have 141 folks who have engaged with us throughout the process. They're distributed based on the map here on the left. So each of these circles represent their size based on the number of folks who have engaged with us, color-coded by region, and then obviously located in the appropriate regions. You can see the majority of folks are concentrated in the Portland Metro and Willamette Valley regions. The top right, you can see that the majority of folks come from the government. That's the big yellow box. We also have a good number of folks from the private sector and the consumer-owned utilities. Those are the dark and light blue boxes in the middle. Good number of nonprofits in the light yellow, and then some other categories of places that people are associated with as well. To our knowledge, 15% of the folks who have engaged thus far have some association with environmental justice issues. And what have they been telling us? One of the primary things we wanted to understand are the types of threats that are being experienced across the state. And that's what this map summarizes for us here. So we have a pie chart for each of the regions, their size based on the number of threats that were cited. And then the color or the slice of the pie chart represents the type of threat that was cited. And this is where we start to see a trend emerging in our analysis and the feedback we're getting. You'll notice that the pink, red, and purple slices of the pie tend to be largest across all of the regions. These represent red for wildfire, purple for windstorm, and pink for winter storm. These three threats tend to rise to the top with regard to priority on a very frequent basis. We also asked which subsector tends to be impacted most. The bar chart on the left summarizes this for us, where electricity was cited most frequently, followed by liquid fuels, in this case specifically petroleum, and then natural gas. Something important to note about this figure is that we did have more engagement from the liquid fuels private sector relative to the electricity or natural gas subsectors. And so the references to disruptions in liquid fuels might be disproportionately high. The bar chart on the right informs us of how long it takes to restore service. And what we can see is that across all three of the subsectors, the most common response is that it's a matter of days. So really less than a week's time for service to be restored. Now we asked a number of questions around preparedness. All I'm summarizing here is the presence of backup generators. And you can see that this pie chart is roughly divided into thirds. The dark blue are responses where a generator is present. Yellow, a generator is not present, and then gray is when it's unknown. Something important to note about when a generator is present is that there is a lot of variability with regard to the operational capacity of that generator. So there were some instances where the generator could offer full operational capacity, but could also be as limited as just providing a safe shutdown. Our last category of feedback is related to environmental justice issues. The pie chart on the left highlights the types of communities that are of highest concern with regard to impact. The most frequently cited community is low income, that's the dark blue, and that's followed by rural communities in the dark yellow. The bar chart on the right shows us what these areas of concern primarily relate to. So the most common concern is a power supply disruption. This aligns well with what we saw earlier, where the most common disruption is noticed in the electricity subsector. And then that's followed by toxic fume exposure. So these are a high-level summary of what other folks are telling us thus far. And what we want to know from you guys is, do you agree with what other people are telling us? And so question 2 in your Slido is asking from what you just heard, what of that resonates with you? You're saying, yes, you guys are on the right track. You're hearing the right thing. This aligns with my experiences, my understanding of the situation. Question 3 is the opposite. What do you disagree with? Anything that does not align with your understanding or your experiences, or anything that's missing and you think needs to be on our radar? Let us know in question 3. Questions 4 through 8 all relate to environmental justice. So just requesting more insight here. Anything that you have knowledge on, we would love to learn from you there. This is the largest section of questions or collection that we'll be asking of you at a single time. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to work through these, and then we'll move on to the risk assessment preliminary results. Oh, yeah, if we have any questions, also please feel free to speak up in the room or online, put something in the chat or just come off mute.
Yes, we have one. How much do we know about your respondents' awareness of the possible hazards, i.e. toxic fumes or other hazards that people don't know much about?
How much do we know about their awareness of different hazards?
Respondents aware.
I'm sorry, I don't know if I quite understand what they're
Well,
asking.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah, please do.
I'm just saying that we may all be really aware that there's a flooding risk or wildfire, because I know I live in the middle of a forest, but really people don't know very much about toxic fumes or what could blow up. I know Multnomah County has just done some research on this. So I'm just saying, when people are responding to this, there's probably no way that you can see like how knowledgeable is this person and how knowledgeable are people. We know more about some risks than other risks.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, we have a collection. So the representation of folks, these could be folks that are with the government. These can be personal stories. They could be from private sector. So we have a collection, you know, of folks that represent different organizations or just no organization specifically. So these can be based on personal experiences. It could be based on their education, any array of things. So I would agree, we don't know each individual person's level of education, I would say, specific to what the primary threats are. I'll give you another minute to wrap up these questions, and then we'll move on to the next section.
And the follow-up said, and said, so basically this is a tally of perception, not actual hazard exposure and vulnerability.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, it cannot be considered actual hazard exposure and vulnerability. This isn't a study on the exposure. This is what the people have chosen to engage with us, what their experiences and primary concerns are. Okay, so we are now going to move on to our preliminary results for the risk assessment. We're going to start with the electricity subsector. And as a reminder, we have 41 utilities in the state, and many of these utilities serve multiple regions. And so what we can do is look at each region and how many utilities can speak to that region, and that can give us our sample size, or N. In other words, how many utilities can actually fill out a survey specific to that region. And so we have the sample size summarized in this map. It ranges between 7 on the low end, 11 on the high end. In the Willamette Valley, the sample size is 11. And we had about 50% response rate from the utilities. So 20 of those 41 did fill out our survey. Important to note that the 3 IOUs did complete the survey for us. And so we have our actual sample size in this map with the pie charts. On the low end is 4, high end is 9, which is in the Willamette Valley. So you guys were on the higher end. And then here we have our final vulnerability rankings in the form of a matrix. So we have the regions across the top and the threats across the side. And I'm just going to highlight a few key takeaways from this matrix. First of all, our electric utilities most often prioritize 4 threats. First was cyber attack. And then we had those 3 threats that we highlighted earlier that keep rising to the top. So wildfire, windstorm, and winter storm. We have a number of threats highlighted here or outlined in boxes. These are on the higher end across the different regions, and they're largely driven by exposure and impacts. And so for the Willamette Valley, you can see that for flood, wildfire, and windstorm, relative to some of these other regions, your score for exposure and impact would have been higher. Portland Metro drought, this one was driven largely by adaptive capacity. So from that, you can deduce that your adaptive capacity was stronger relative to the Portland Metro area specific to drought. And then with the human caused threats, there are several things that I want to highlight for you. First of all, this feedback is really dominated by the smaller utilities. So while we did get surveys completed by the IOUs, they actually gave us no information or very limited information, I should say, for human caused threats, for cyber attack and physical attack. So this is really strongly representative of the smaller utilities, these results. Across these, the higher rankings are largely driven by exposure and impact. And you'll notice that there are 4 responses that are in bold and are underlined. They all have a value of 2. They're in the Eastern and Portland Metro regions. And these scores are artificially low. So we actually got no feedback from any of the utilities related to potential impact of these human caused threats for those 2 regions. So had we had a value for impact, we know that the total score would have been higher. And so we know that those scores are lower than they would be. And then finally, you might notice that we have little variability across the regions for a given threat. So if you look at a specific threat, if you look at a specific region and you can see that each of the threats, there's quite a bit of variability there, but across the regions, it's more consistent. And so what we can do is identify where the variability lies by digging into the nuances of the data a little bit more. And this is why I want to give you some information on adaptive capacity. So I'm going to walk you through how we structured adaptive capacity in the survey. Please don't be overwhelmed by this slide. You do not have to study it. It is referenced in your handout. The key takeaway from this is that what we did is we gave 5 categories of mitigation measures to the utilities specific to cyber attack. And those categories are identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. What this table gives you is some examples of what those different categories look like, so that you can have a clear understanding of what would fall in each of those categories. So you can reference those in your handout if you'd like. There's one similar to this that's specific to physical threats as well. So we give this table to the utilities, and we ask them to tell us their maturity rating with regard to implementing these types of measures. So on the lower end of maturity, we would have evolving. And this is where they're just now getting the document in place. It's not very well integrated yet. Mid-level maturity would be embedding. That's where they're really integrating this measure into their business processes, their procedures. And then optimizing is when they're really considered to be a leader in their field with regard to implementing that type of mitigation measure. And so what we're going to see moving forward is a color scheme for the adaptive capacity slides, where lighter shades of teal and orange represent a lower level of maturity, and the deeper shades of teal and orange represent the highest level of maturity, optimizing. And so what we can do is we can organize all of this data and summarize it in some figures. So what we have in these bar charts is cyber attack on the left and physical attack on the right. And you can see those darker shades of teal being reported across each of these 5 categories for these 2 different threats. And then you can see some reporting that they're embedding, so that mid-level. And then that lightest shade of teal, we see it for identify and respond under the cyber attack. And so what we're looking for, we're training our eye to go to those areas where the lightest shades are present, because what that does is it illustrates an opportunity for growth, right? So where it's less mature, there's more opportunity to mature the implementation of that measure. And so in general, you might say that identify and respond, and identify, detect, and respond all have more opportunity for growth specific to cyber attack relative to the other measures and relative to physical attack. So that's areas where we might want to invest maturing those measures. So we can take a similar approach for natural hazard mitigation measures. And so here we're looking at the physical category of measures, and these are specific to wildfire in your region. So we have harden. This could be something like applying a fire resistant coating, redundancy, having something like a backup power source, remove, actually taking that infrastructure out of the hazard zones, upgrade, maybe you have a water pump and you're gonna increase the efficiency of that pump. And then weatherize, adding something like storm windows. And so we can see here, now we're looking at the orange color for the natural hazards. And again, we're training our eye to look for those lighter shades. And so you can see there's opportunity for growth across all of these categories. Potentially remove and weatherize might have the most opportunity here. Our last grouping of measures would be operational measures specific to natural hazards. And so here we have continuity of operation plans. So this is making sure operations can continue under different circumstances. We have emergency operation plan, identifying the roles of different people, different entities. Emergency response plan, what are the steps we're going to follow in an emergency due to different threats? And the integrity safety plans. So we're assessing and mitigating the risks specific to threats. And then finally, we have situational awareness. So obviously understanding what's going on during an emergency. And so again, we're training our eye to look at those lighter shades, and there's pretty good opportunity across all 5 of these categories. Perhaps situational awareness would be the most mature category of measures here specific to wildfire in your region. So what I'm going to be doing is giving you guys snapshots of some of the results where we saw the highest opportunity for growth. And so quickly on this slide, just a quick summary, we have physical measures on the left, operational measures on the right. The top left is the Cascadia event and the bottom left is windstorm. So you can see weatherize and perhaps remove have some of these lower ratings for maturity for the Cascadia event, and then for windstorm, kind of the same. You have upgrade, weatherize, harden, so looking for those lighter shades. Operational measures on the top, you have Cascadia on the top right, and then windstorm operational measures on the bottom right, and quite a bit of opportunity for growth across all of those. One thing I will point out is that for Cascadia, situational awareness did tend to have some lower reporting for situational awareness specifically. So this is where we want to do another check-in. So the same questions you answered last time for stakeholder engagement, we're wanting to understand with question 9, what resonates with you. So what you're seeing, do you agree with it? You want to say yes, affirm, you're on the right track. Question 10, anything you disagree with, something that doesn't seem quite right to you, or that you want to just put on our radar so that we're tuning into it. So I'll give you a minute to answer these 2 questions and answer any questions that anyone has. Yeah, please go ahead.
So I have to say I'm very impressed. It's obviously had a lot of work gone into it. But I have a question about how you found the interaction between the different utilities. You categorized each one of the utilities and what they're doing, but how is the overarching integrated policy being addressed? So, for example, one of the concerns we have in Willamette is that the existing Lieberg Dam and hydroelectric plant is planned to be removed. We recently have had the winter storm, which took out a lot of the power lines, and it also took out one of the power lines at the time that it happened. So the proposal is that the one of the power lines supply power for the region. So if the Lieberg Dam generating capacity is no longer there, we've lost a lot of flexibility due to operational interpretations by EWA. For commercial reasons, they've decided that's the best way to go. But in terms of the risk mitigation, it's altered the dynamics enormously. We've also had a gentleman who was using dynamite underneath the vulnerable power lines recently, which got everyone's attention. But it does speak to what you're addressing, in as much as bad actors can do things like that. We've got so much exposure to very long power lines coming down from port. So how is that being addressed?
So the question is, how are we addressing, are you talking about the interdependencies again?
Yes, there's definitely an interdependency. I guess you guys are the experts on this, but it's my understanding that there are only 2 of the utilities that actually generate their own power, and the rest buy income. So obviously, if something happens to one of the two generators, it's going to have a different impact than something happening to someone with only a receiver.
I might be able to.
Oh,
And just so I think I understand your question and the issue with the data, I read your letter report. The concept being, to kind of reframe what you pointed out is, EWEB makes a choice to not operate a local power production facility and instead relies upon power coming in from Bonneville, right? And that those Bonneville Power Administration high voltage transmission lines, many miles in length, potentially great risk because of just simply distance, I suspect, and other factors you might put into that. And so the issue or the question perhaps becomes, what to make of what on one hand could be seen as a utility company making a choice based on other, I don't know if that can factor why they make a choice, right? Perhaps some environmental, probably cost, maybe they would have to upgrade that down, I suspect for various reasons. We have some data. So without going into specifics, I don't know exactly why they made that choice, but they made a trade-off to instead rely on more on power coming from out of the local region. How do we consider that? It's a very difficult consideration for at this very moment. But let me just say that I would like to learn more about the situation. And I don't have an answer for you, but what I'd like to do is learn more and see how that type of situation might be addressed in our energy security plan, or at least acknowledged for future consideration and work. And then one of the theories that maybe Michael leads our, was a team member on our energy strategy for a separate project, but related. And there's probably a theory of philosophy that local production of power, I mean, fundamentally, it is lower risk, right? Generation closer to where the people are simply reduces the miles of transmission lines and other hazards outside of your region. So I think there might be, we'd have to talk. And I think there's a sort of consideration that we can make to that particular point. I apologize, this is kind of a long-winded government answer, but I honestly don't have enough knowledge. And yeah, it's an easy answer.
And in general, this document this year is a snapshot of where we are right now. As we progress over the years and update it, we'll show what's changed, and that might result in different mitigation strategies being put sort of at the front. But we're looking at the system as we are and how to make what we have this snapshot more resilient. Not necessarily looking at, there's a plan 5 years down the road to change something or phase something out. We're looking now, not 10 years out.
I understand that completely, and it's perfectly normal that you would say that. But for us, of course, we're concerned that the peak time EWEB moves ahead and decommissions that place. And to our surprise last night, we received from an interested buyer an expression of interest in buying Leeward down the power station. So the dynamics are quite significant, and EWEB has made their decision based on what they feel to be absolute factual numbers. It doesn't make sense on their economics. I was saying a little bit more than that, but there's definitely things which there needs to be a process just to address the security side rather than just the commercial side. It isn't just the interests of Eugene anymore. Now it's much bigger.
Yeah, and EWEB doesn't just serve. I mean, they have a region, but of course that I don't know exactly how much power it was producing, but perhaps more than just EWEB service. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess I'm just build off that. I'll talk a little more about the energy strategy. That is our opportunity to look at that longer term vision of where we need to get to in the transition of the energy environment, and the opportunity distributed resources offered to us, and the potential change, maybe changing some of our utility models, the way we look at things, to have more community resources, as Max is pointing out, whether that's solar, or that's hydropower, or whatever it is. There is resilience benefits to it, there's affordability benefits to it, more community control and access. And so we just have to figure out the long-term kind of affordability for that. And so part of the energy strategy is one, doing some modeling and take a look at how that would change things. and compare affordability and maybe changing the way we use tools, but also, what does that look like, if we don't do it? I mean,
That's right, that's what I expect from the modeling.
and then take a look at that and create some policy recommendations. So we're not going to decide that, but that is what we need to sure the governor's office.
Okay, good. Don't take up too much.
No, I appreciate it. And one thing I do just want to highlight is please, where we get into the risk mitigation measures, please do highlight this, right? These concerns. We want to understand in any of these unique dynamics that could exist in the Willamette Valleys, for example. We'll have opportunities for you to highlight that as well for Slido, but this is the kind of information we want, right? So that we can incorporate it into how we're framing all of the preliminary results. So it's exactly the type of information that we're asking for. So thank you.
So one question online, does the data include responses from all relevant utilities and providers, or is this a summation of data from those that responded to DOE?
This is the 20 utilities that gave us feedback through the survey, the hybrid survey. Yeah, we invited all utilities to participate and 20 of them opted to give us information.
And 9 out of 11 in the Willamette Valley.
Yeah.
And maybe just a point of that, that's no disrespect against the 20 that didn't respond. It's simply a matter of timing and capacity. You can imagine many utilities in our state are very small, with only a few people that have, you know, the ability to respond to a data heavy survey. So I just want to make sure everybody, like, if you didn't respond, we're gonna come talk to you later. But at this point, it's totally fine. We understand.
Yeah, and 50% is actually quite an impressive number for a response rate. So we're very thankful for it to be that.
And follow up, what is the total of everyone responded?
The total number of utilities that responded, 20 across the state. Yeah, and then 9 specifically that represent Willamette Valley. Okay, so let's now move on to natural gas. So here we have 3 service providers in the state. All of them do serve multiple regions. And so our sample sizes vary between 1 and 3 across the regions. And we did get a full response from all 3 of the utility, the service providers. And so our actual sample size matches the potential sample size in the Willamette Valley was 1. And so here's the final vulnerability rankings, again, in this matrix format. A few key takeaways here is that in the natural gas subsector, the threats that were most often prioritized were the human caused threats. So cyber attack and physical attack. These are some of the higher vulnerability rankings that were largely driven by exposure. So from this, you can deduce that Willamette Valley had a lower score for exposure relative to these other regions for cyber attack and lightning. And then Southwest for wildfire, this higher ranking was largely driven by impact. So Willamette Valley's score for impact was relatively lower. And then for physical attack, these higher scores or rankings were largely driven by both exposure and adaptive capacity. And you can see Willamette Valley does fall into the higher end of the spectrum here. And something that we learned after the fact, after the service providers had completed the survey, is that for physical attack, they were considering scenarios where perhaps someone was digging and hit a gas line and caused damage. And so as we defined human attacks earlier, yeah, this isn't an intentional attack on the system, right? And so that was considered, and so that could have impacted what these results finally ended up being. So again, a snapshot of the adaptive capacity. The most common trend from the natural gas subsector is that they told us that their implementation of these measures were optimized largely across the state and across the different categories. And you can see that for cyber attack here on the left. For physical attack, we do have some clear areas that represent opportunities for growth. So that would be related to identify, protect, and detect for physical attacks. Similarly, for natural hazards, most of the responses were that the mitigation measures were already optimized. So I'm just highlighting a few areas here to point out. On the left side, we have physical measures. The top is wildfire, the bottom is windstorm. Most of these are ranked as optimized. You might notice, however, that there are only 4 bars in those bar charts instead of 5. And so we didn't actually get any information from the service providers related to remove. And of course, we don't know why we didn't get responses there. It could be they didn't know the rating. It could be that that's not a feasible measure for them to pursue. We don't know the reason, but we didn't get a response there. And then for operational measures, on the right-hand side, this is specific for Cascadia. You can see a few opportunities here for growth, particularly again, pointing out that situational awareness specific for the Cascadia event, rated to be a little bit less mature. So we're going to do the same check-in now relating to natural gas. Now we're on questions 11, 12. 11 is what resonates with you. 12 is anything you disagree with. And while you guys are filling that out, again, if there are any questions, would love to take those now.
Yeah, so we got one in the chat. Do you anticipate the natural gas pipeline being disrupted by Cascadia? We get CNG via pipeline. Should we be expecting not to have that available, and any guess how long?
So because we didn't do the technical analysis, I don't feel like I can give you I can't give you a firm response. I'm guessing Max would be.
Well, I would say that's a good question, and the classic government answer is it depends. Pipelines, the gas pipelines buried underground, are more protected, particularly in the valley, from bad shaking. I suspect, though, there would be a period on a Cascadia scenario, 9.0 earthquake, you could probably expect to be without gas. Even if it's not because of damage to the infrastructure, but because there has to be safety checks along the entirety of that system, and that could take time. And so, yeah, I think it's a reasonable consideration that gas would be perhaps disrupted in a 9.0 earthquake. Like I said, even if it's not from physical damage, but simply as a matter of inspection to make sure that it's safe. So compressed CNG, compressed natural gas, often comes by a truck and is moved around. And again, trucking infrastructure, bridges and roads, could be severely damaged in that earthquake scenario. And maybe just one more thing, if you think about the earthquake scenario, it really depends on the epicenter, right? There's so many variables. We've given you maps that are snapshots and sort of models and estimates, but it really depends on where that earthquake might be centered. If it's further north or south from here, then shaking might be less and we might be okay. And even on the infrastructure like natural gas, the natural gas in our region isn't from our region, right? It comes from out of the Northwest. It comes from Canadian sources, Rocky Mountain sources. It's piped in long distances, primarily down the gorge. So anywhere along that chain, there could be disruptions from a major earthquake. And like I said, there's risk along the whole infrastructure. Kind of a long answer to your question. I hope that was sufficient.
And the maps that we showed earlier assume that the entire Cascadia subduction zone slips. So obviously things would be worse closer to the epicenter if it was a more localized slippage. I think it's safe to say, though, there would be some disruption in the Willamette Valley at 9.0 earthquake.
I agree.
And reminder that the maps that we created were high and very high risk. Willamette Valley certainly is in that moderate level. You can look at the Dogami maps online if you're curious, but it's not that there's no risk in this region, it's that it's less than those coastal areas. Anything else? Okay, we will move on now to liquid fuels.
Natural gas got here. We have another natural gas.
Yeah.
I should have looked you for that question.
Yeah, no, you're fine. I'd say one additional thing to like a major asset in the Pacific Northwest is from the natural gas infrastructure standpoint, is Jackson Prairie. So there's also that addition of, Jackson Prairie is interrupted by electricity or anything like that. That could also be additional risks. That's not in, it's in the Pacific Northwest region, but it's not region.
Yeah, maybe just a clarification. Jackson Prairie is a natural gas underground storage facility in Washington State near the town of Chehalis. That is operated by Puget Sound Energy, right?
Yeah.
It provides gas storage for the entire region that Northwest Natural, as well as the other utilities that utilize that gas. That facility in particular provides important pressure on the pipelines, as I understand it, and keeps the gas flowing, even if it's not Northwest Natural facility. It's really interdependent on whole natural gas systems. So
Yeah.
is that right?
Okay. So now liquid fuels, We had 13 folks participate with us, and their sample sizes across the region range between 7 and 12. The Willamette Valley is on the higher end with 12. And here we have our vulnerability rankings for liquid fuels. The threats most often prioritized by this subsector were cyber attacks and winter storms. And here for the Cascadia event, the Willamette Valley does have one of the higher rankings, along with Northwest, Portland Metro, and Southwest. Not surprising here, these are largely driven by responses related to, or values related to potential impact of that event. And then here in the eastern region, this region tends to score higher across flood, lightning, wildfire, and windstorm, and this is largely driven by ratings for adaptive capacity. And so relative to them, you can deduce that the Willamette Valley had stronger scores for adaptive capacity for these threats. And then again, in physical attack, like we saw in electricity, you'll notice that we have some of these values that are in bold and underlined. These again are artificially low. So like we saw with electricity, we got no responses as it relates to potential impacts for physical attack. And so again, we know that these scores would be higher if we had a value there. A snapshot of the adaptive capacity responses. You might notice that these look quite similar. Cyber attack is on the left, physical attack is on the right. So we got very similar responses for these two threats. And you can see the opportunities for growth here, largely for detect, respond, recover, protect, pretty well distributed here. So a lot of opportunities there. For the liquid fuels, we couldn't create a similar bar chart like we've been looking at for natural hazards for the other two subsectors, because this was the subsector we were able to conduct the technical analysis on. So the data is structured very differently. So what we're going to do is go ahead and move right back into Slido, getting your responses with what you resonate with for question 13, anything you disagree with for question 14. And again, if there are any questions, happy to answer those now as well. Give you another minute to wrap these up, and then we'll move on to our risk mitigation measures.
I'm a little bit surprised at some of the responses in that liquid fuels section. Liquid fuels industry is extremely polished in responses and things like that, and for many years they've had to be. And of course, you're addressing many of the local dimensions, but have you actually fed back, or do you intend to feed back any of the responses that you found to some of the oil majors, for example, to say, hey, we've identified this, maybe something that needs to be improved here?
We will certainly share the results with the people who took the survey and participated with us, that's for sure. And there are some of the majors who operate in the state, just for distribution of fuel. So that's certainly on our to-do list. Yep. As you can tell from we're sort of at an interim stage in our process right here. We have a little more cohesiveness in the plan put together, going back out to all the both utilities, private energy providers, stakeholders with our results, and then start talking about next steps. It's certainly an important part of this all.
Okay, so we are now going to enter into the phase of risk mitigation measures. As I mentioned before, you guys are really going to be doing the heavy lifting here, so I'm not going to be talking as much. Before I dive into these lists of risk mitigation measures, I just want to give us a reminder that there is a relationship between cost and effectiveness. So if we have something like an operational measure, that tends to have a lower cost associated with it, but also tends to be less effective relative to other measures. Physical measures tend to have a higher cost, but also can be very effective. And of course, we have a number of measures that can lie along this spectrum. We have efficiency improvements, policy, increasing in effectiveness a bit, but can have a time delay associated with it before it gets fully implemented, all the way up to something like undergrounding and replacing pipes, which obviously is quite costly, but can have a very high impact. And so just a reminder of how we can frame our thinking around some of these mitigation measures. We're going to be asking you guys to prioritize these so that we can understand what is most important for your region. And we're going to be starting with physical measures at the high level. So we're looking at these measures that could apply to all systems, any of the energy subsectors. And so I'm not going to read all of these to you word for word, but just kind of walking through some of the highlights. We're starting with drones. So this is implementing these so that we can improve our ability to inspect what's going on, for example, during an emergency. We have 3 examples of redundancy here, each of those distinct. On the the right-hand side, we have system segmentation. So this is where we're working to more efficiently isolate damaged areas by subdividing or segmenting the system. On the very bottom on the right, you'll notice protect. This one is specific to the human caused threats. So remember, we had those 5 categories of measures that can be implemented. Those that fall into the protect category tend to have more physical measures associated with them. So something like air gapping or restricting access to critical infrastructure for physical safety, that sort of thing. So we've included that here, specifically protect category for the human caused threats. So our rhythm is going to be that I'll tee up a grouping of mitigation measures. And then you guys will go into Slido, and what I'm asking you to do is rank these. So here we're looking at question number 15. And what you're going to do is simply drag the mitigation measures, putting the most important one first, and then putting them in order there. Within Slido, you do have to rank every single one of the mitigation measures to complete that question. So please put them all in order. Question 16 here is giving you an opportunity to include a measure that you don't see on the list and you feel like should be there. So please do add any in that you feel are missing.
Casey, we have one question.
Okay.
On the drones, I know Portland has some legal restrictions on their usage. Does this affect the utilities in other places? Are there any legal restrictions across the state for using drones for inspections?
Yeah, I don't know the policies region by region, but I have been hearing, I am aware that it varies across the state. Do y'all have specific insight into that?
I know the answer to that question. That's interesting. No, I don't know.
Yeah.
Look into it.
Yeah, I will say that concern has been brought up on a consistent basis around restrictions and what's allowed and what's not allowed, both within Oregon and outside the state, actually.
Feels like those ideas, Casey, about policy change that would lead to a physical inspection change using drones. And maybe first there has to be a change in law to allow drones to be used in that area.
And there is a difference between commercial use and recreational use too. So it could be that there's a commercial license available for
From the utility themselves instead of just a person flying through a critical infrastructure.
Yeah. We'll give you another minute to wrap this up and then we'll move on to the next group of mitigation measures. And if you're filling it out in hand on paper in the room, you can just put your number next to it to indicate the order you'd like. Okay, so I do understand some people may have a hard stop at the hour, so I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the next topic. You can continue working on this, and as a reminder, it will stay open beyond this meeting. So I'm just gonna tee up the next group of mitigation measures. We're still looking at this high level perspective, measures that could apply across all systems. This time we're focused on the operational category. So we have after action reviews, we have the integration of artificial intelligence, facilitating the operational plans and monitoring, memorandums of understanding with the government. So formalizing what these relationships will look like and the roles that different entities will play. On the right-hand side, we do have several studies that are being recommended. And then on the very bottom, you have maturity, like we saw in the last one, that this last entry is focused specifically on human caused threats. So this is just in general, improving the maturity of the implementation of all of those categories as they relate to cyber attack and physical attack. So now we're going to move on to questions 17 and 18. Same thing as last time. 17 is ranking them most important first, working your way down. 18 is your opportunity to specifically call out a measure that you feel like should be included if it's missing from the list. We'll give about 2 minutes to work on this, and then I'll tee up the next one. Give you 1 more minute and then we'll move on to our next grouping. Okay, you guys can keep working. I am going to go ahead and tee up our electricity subsector. So this is where we are transitioning the format just a little bit in the questions. Here we're going into a bit more detail. We're focusing on a subset of the threats here. So we're looking at the Cascadia event, human caused threats, wildfire, wind, storm, and winter storm. We have the physical category of measures on the top, operational on the bottom. And you might notice that some on this slide are bold. These are the measures that we found directly fill a gap that we were able to identify through the stakeholder engagement efforts and the feedback from the utilities. And so quickly, the questions we're going to be focusing on here, 19 and 20 are specific to the physical measures for the electricity subsector. 19 is ranking, 20 is writing something in that's not included. 21 and 22 relate to the operational measures. So I'll keep the table up if you want to reference that while you're working on those questions. Again, I'll give you about 2 minutes because I do want to tee up all of these before the close of the hour. You can keep working on them for as long as you want. Okay, so thank you all for working so hard. We're getting close to the end of this topic of risk mitigation measures. We have natural gas now formatted the same as electricity. The threats we're focusing on here are the Cascadia event, human caused threats, wildfire, and wind storm. Again, physical on the top, operational on the bottom. The bolded items directly fill a gap that we were able to identify. The questions associated with this are going to be questions 23 through 26. So we'll give you a couple minutes to get started on those, and I'll put that table back up there for your reference. I'm going to go ahead and tee up our last section while you guys are working. This is related to liquid fuels. Again, the same structure here. The threats we're focusing on are Cascadia, the human caused threats, and then wind and winter storm. The questions associated with this are 27 through 30. You guys know the drill now, so you can just keep working on these. Give you a couple more minutes and then we'll wrap up the meeting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and present some of these final slides just to let you know for our next steps. We're going to be taking all of this great information that you guys are working on right now. Thank you so much for taking the time to prioritize these measures for us. We're going to compile all of this across all of the regions and finalize this first draft of the ESP, and we'll have a project rollout in the coming months. And we do want to take an opportunity here to highlight These last few questions in Slido, these are open-ended. The first one, question 31, this is specific to your region. So anything specific to the Willamette Valley that you didn't see reflected in the information today, please do let us know about it so that we're aware of whatever that is that you need to highlight for us. Question 32, any comments or feedback at all that you have, we welcome it there. And 33 is what can Odo do moving forward to better serve your needs? So from there, I'm going to actually hand over to our other Odo team to walk through the project that was highlighted earlier, the strategy.
Okay, so we mentioned this earlier before, you keep working on the slide or whatever, but so I'm going to talk about Oregon's energy strategy. So complementary to what we're doing with the energy security plan, we have kind of a larger macro level look at the energy strategy for Oregon. And it's just starting out. And so this is a great opportunity. The energy security plan will certainly inform the work we're doing on energy strategy. And both are iterative, they'll be updated over time, which is great. And so in the 2023 legislative session, legislature directed us to develop an energy strategy. And the reason we're doing this is Oregon has very robust climate and energy goals, and we need to figure out how we can do it. And beyond how we can do it, how we can direct all our resources, all our state agencies, all our stakeholders across the state, kind of direct everybody working on a shared vision. And so the only way we're going to be able to do this successfully is with a lot of stakeholder engagement, just like we're doing here today on the energy security plan. There's going to be great opportunity for the energy strategy to offer a lot of input, get everybody involved as much as possible. And so that's going to be through working groups. There's going to be advisory committees that people can apply to be on. There's going to be listening sessions across the state, virtual as well as live. And so there's going to be a lot of opportunities to offer feedback and a couple of different phases to do that. So we'll first start this summer. We'll be doing a lot of outreach, talking to everybody about things we're just talking about, the trade-offs of resilience versus distributed resources versus resources being farther away, and the transmission lines that we need to draw that electricity in. We want to take advantage of more wind in Montana or more solar in the Southwest. We have to figure out a way to get it here, and that's a big deal in electricity. Or we've got Northwest Naturals looking at all kinds of different ways to decarbonize their fuel structures, like adding hydrogen. We have dedicated hydrogen pipes when we need to develop more renewable natural gas facilities within the state. Another kind of localized energy resource that could certainly be taken advantage of. So one, it's taking a look at all these different options and the trade-offs and doing some technical modeling. But then it's also, what are some policy recommendations? How do we take a look at that modeling, those results, and what are the different pathways? So it's kind of a long-term view. As Thomas pointed out, the energy security plan is kind of looking at what are we looking at today? And this is more taking a look at, okay, we've got some long-term goals for our state to 2050. How are we going to get there? And what are some different things we can test along the way and kind of plan for our future? Does anybody have any questions about that? So it's kind of a big concept. No? Okay, great. So we've got a webinar June 3rd coming up. I would encourage you to attend. Within that, we're going to be talking, kind of updating on here's where we're at with the energy strategy, but we'll also be talking about here are the ways to engage with the energy strategy going forward. Here's some upcoming meetings. We're getting our facilitation contractor on board, and they should help us arrange some of those meetings and start developing a calendar, which we're certainly excited about. In the meantime, we do have an email list. You can sign up for our listserv and get regular emails on strategies and provide different ways to involve yourself. If you want to email us directly, we have a general email as well. Any additional questions about the energy strategy? I think that's it. Max, did you have any closing remarks?
I'll only thank everybody. Well, things are going online. Here's our contact information. From ourselves. Deanna's not here today, but she's another member of our team. We will provide this information on our website, the slides on our website soon. You always can get a hold of us before then, but probably by the end of next week, I suspect we'll have all of our recordings. I'm gonna have your work. Recordings as well as the slides posted to our website, so you can always go back and review the information. If you didn't have a chance to finish Slido, or you wanted to talk to somebody else in your organization by the end of the month, would be great if people could do that feedback. We'll take paper copies. And if you want to talk more about anything and everything on our project, please come get hold of us. I do encourage people to track the energy strategy as well and be engaged in that. I know we're kind of asking a lot of stakeholders. There's so many important things ongoing in the energy space right now in our state. Hopefully, if you can participate in any and all forums, would be great. So thank you very much for coming.
On your way out, there's a page over here with 3 QR codes. One takes you to the energy strategy website. One takes you to the energy security plan website, and the other is a PDF of upcoming projects available, just in general.
Thank you again. You don't mind right now? No? Okay, so no further questions. It's exactly on time. I can't believe it. Unbelievable. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.